Hola, bienvenidos a un nuevo capítulo de Hablemos de Procesos. Hoy vamos a continuar en la serie hablando sobre libros que están explorando diferentes áreas de todo lo que implica la gestión por procesos. Y hoy tenemos un invitado espectacular que nos acompaña y va a estar hablando sobre uno de sus más recientes libros. Acaba de salir hace apenas 2 meses. Así que déjenme darle la bienvenida a Bernd Ruecker, quien nos acompaña desde Alemania. ¿Cómo estás, Bernd?
I'm good, thanks.
All right, just to give everyone a quick intro, we've had other videos talking about Camunda, which we're going to talk a little bit today probably, and we've also had conversations about automation, or at least parts of it, but I'm very excited about getting a chance to talk to you because, like I just mentioned, you just came out with a book not long ago that specifically addresses practical process automation. Exactly, yeah, that's correct. So thank you very much for joining us. Let us go ahead and get started. And if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about your professional and your academic background so that everyone is well acquainted with you.
Sure, happy to. So my name is Bernd Ruecker, as you already said. I'm one of the 2 co-founders of Camunda. So I personally have a background in basically software technology. That's also was what I did in university, and I came across the whole topic of process automation relatively early, already during high school, and I helped a friend basically automating his order fulfillment process. I wouldn't have called it like that at that point in time, but that made me dive into the whole topic of process automation, workflow engines from a software development perspective. That was always my background, and I was looking at that very much. I was intrigued by the whole topic. In a way, sucked into the whole workflow engine universe. I never escaped since then. And yeah, that was basically that was the whole starting. And that's kind of also the first steps into the Camunda journey. I'm not sure if you think you're also interested in that. I'm happy to elaborate on that.
Well, yeah, I think it'll be interesting just to know how you guys came together with Jacob, and then how did the whole thing just started? You know, how did you guys decided that we need an additional BPMS because the market already had some of them, but what did you guys think would make yours different from everything that was out there in the market?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that, and it's actually an interesting story. So in the very beginning, I was doing that work for my friend. I used an open source workflow engine at that time from JBoss, JBPM. And what I did is I actually started writing about that. So that's kind of my style. I just heard that this is nowadays called work out loud. So in a way, I started to do presentations at the Java user group. I started writing. At some point in time, Jakob approached me and said, hey, this is kind of interesting. We're doing this network for BPM professionals. Would you like to write an article? I said, yes, sure. I, by the way, never did that. But it was my connection to Jakob. And then we started discussing certain things. We said, hey, this is super interesting. We're both passionate around the whole BPM topic. And then like very shortened, we decided to start a consulting company around that, Camunda, back in 2008. And we early on wrote our first book, The Real Life BPMN, which is, by the way, also available in Spanish. A professor from Chile translated that. And this was very successful in Germany in the beginning. And this brought us into the whole game of giving consultancy, giving trainings, having a lot of contacts with different organizations using BPMN and doing process automation. So we had roughly, I would say, 400 or 500 different customers, different organizations doing things. That meant we basically saw a lot of things. We saw what worked and what didn't work. And we also saw that these very, let's say, small open source frameworks like JVPM were a bit too technical. They missed a lot of the, let's say, the business process side of things. And the BPMS at that time, they were very vendor driven. They were in a way low code, which did not work out at that point in time. It doesn't either today. Maybe we discuss that later on, let's see. But especially for what companies tried to do, that simply didn't work with the big vendors, BPMS. And we said, hey, there's such a great opportunity if you do something which is developer friendly. That's still what Camunda is. So meant for the developer that they can really be productive, but they get additional tools to automate processes. So developer friendly, that's a huge gap in the market. Mm-hmm. And then we basically said, okay, there are these open source tools. We contributed to these at that point in time already. Let's take this as a basis and put a product on top of that. And then we decided to transform the whole company from a consulting business to being an open source vendor, which is quite a big change actually. But so far I think we did pretty well. So that's kind of the story around that. And it took us a while. We started 2008, we transformed 2013. Now we're in 2021. By now you can really see that we're very successful what we are doing, but it's kind of a 13 years journey. So that's quite a while actually.
It's quite a journey. And I think you mentioned the community, and I think they play a key role in also the sense of how Camunda has evolved, because you guys have a very active community that's just out there interacting with each other and sharing and collaborating. So I think that plays a key role as well.
100%. I mean, we did last week, 2 weeks ago, time is melting somehow. We did our first community summit online, and we had almost 3,000 registrations. So a lot of people are joining, and we had a lot of, and that's what I find so super exciting, a lot of community members that showed a lot of things. So it's in the early days, it was like in the very early days, it was me or Jakob who did stuff and walked around, talked about it. After a while, we had other people within our organization doing things. But now we see a lot of people from really the community doing such amazing things in their free time. That's really impressive to see what comes out of that. And yes, the community is definitely super important for us. And I think that's also another kind of unique selling point that sets the company apart from these big vendor BPMS, because you have that passionate community. You have these developers driving a lot of things within the product and all the related places, like answering stuff in forum, discussing things, coming up with best practices, doing tutorials, whatever. There are a lot of things around that which are important to make a good product.
Wow, that sounds great. So before we jump right into the book, let's talk a little bit about a main concept that I know the book addresses, but for the benefit of our audience purposes, could you explain to us what are some of the main differences when we talk about process automation versus task automation? So what are some of we hear both terms sometimes used indistinctly, but I think there are key differences that set them apart. So would you mind sharing with us some of them?
Yeah. So for me, that one of the eye-openers personally was a project at Deutsche Telekom, so the German telecommunication company. They also talked about that pretty publicly, so I can quote this, and there are a lot of slides available. And I found that very interesting. Their journey was, and the use cases was very simple in the beginning. They had technicians out in the field, they had to fix something technically, and then they had to check the line that this really worked what they did. So what they had to do is they had to call an inbound colleague saying, okay, can you please check this line number for me? And then the inbound colleague entered that in some legacy system and basically talked to them back, yes, it works. For doing this, they had to wait like in line for typically 5 minutes until somebody was available. So it was really slow, it was annoying, it was frustrating for everybody involved. And they started with RPA. That's probably something most of the audience will also know about, robotic process automation. So the idea of RPA is you can control a user interface by computer simulating the clicking. I always call that macros on steroids, like you know it probably from Microsoft products.
Sure.
Right, the Excel stuff, right. And they used this to basically control that legacy application, and then they could put a portal on top of that, and the technician could do that now in self-service via the smartphone. So that was an improvement, right? And that was a big success story for them. And then they started to adopt RPA in more places. And after a while, they recognized that if they do that on a bigger scale, they ran into a lot of problems with RPA. And that's until they later recognized was they mixed up task and process automation. So in order for this one technician checking one line, that's a task. That's a single task. I can I need to enter some stuff in a UI, get back a result, and I'm done. That's one task. And I can automate that with RPA very well. I mean, I would use an API if there's an API, but anyway. And that's task automation. And this is a very different thing than automating something that needs multiple steps or multiple of these tasks in a certain sequence, probably doing a decision in between, something like, hey, I need to check this, then I get a response back. Okay, if I got back that response, I go this way and I need to enter it in this system. Afterwards, I have to call that API and then I have to inform a human to do something. Then you have a sequence of things. And that's a very different problem because now you have, I mean, how you describe these flows, who is interested in these flows, what do I want to see in operations or in analysis of these flows, and a lot of these things are very different in task and process automation. So I find it important to understand the difference because there was a lot of mixture of these concepts, especially with the hype of RPA. It's, from my perspective, it's, by the way, not new. Only now, when I started to really differentiate much more between task and process automation, I realized that even things like batch processing, for example, that's quite an old concept, but I still see that in a lot of companies being used. They have a lot of batch jobs, and then they have one batch job running, and that's basically one task because it does one thing, probably for a whole bunch of data, but one task. And then you might have another batch job doing another thing based on the result of the first. And this automates kind of, again, the process. And then I even know customers having very complex setups of, hey, this batch job needs to run before this one and this one not before this one is finished. So they have dependencies on their batch jobs, which is basically the process. And that's the same weird mixture of task automation and process automation. And if you get this clear, and you're looking at what's the problem I'm trying to solve, and if this is process automation, then it makes sense to look at specific technologies to solve that.
So I think, to your point, there are a lot of companies out there who are already doing it. Perhaps they're not necessarily calling it process automation or task automation, but they might be wanting to incorporate some of these capabilities into their day-to-day processes. And I know one of the fears that I've heard a lot of companies when they hear automation is, are we going to lose our job because we incorporate automation as part of our processes? And I know that's perhaps at the early curve of adoption, that's one of the fears that people might have. Once you try it, once you start adopting it, you realize that's not necessarily the end game of automation. But what are your thoughts on whether incorporating automation can potentially drive to people losing their jobs? Is that a realistic fear, or does that have nothing to do with the conversation?
I would say the latter in a way, but it's a very complex question. It's not as easy as answering yes or no, because in a way, of course, if you automate certain things, and independent if that's a task or a process, that might, let's say, take work away from the human. That's the whole point of automating it. I mean, the interesting thing is that positive or negative? And there are a lot of facets how you could look at that. One is, in most scenarios I know of, most people were pretty happy for this work being taken away, because that's normally not the enjoyable work of the day. Like in the telecom example, the person sitting there taking calls and entering data in the system all day long, that was not like, oh, I can't do that anymore. I'm really sad. And normally these companies have different things to do for their people anyway. So it's not that all of them are laid off immediately. Another way to look at that, and I personally find this in a way very interesting and very important to not forget, is we're living in, I mean, okay, worldwide there are probably different models how we exactly live, how the economy works, but most of it's very, very market oriented in a way. And that means if the competition getting new business models out easier or faster, or operating more efficiently, or is able to change their way of working faster, for example, because the pandemic comes around, which nobody has anticipated, then these companies will be more successful. And that's nothing I can choose. And if I choose not to be part of this journey, that normally means that the others will be more successful, and that might even put me out of business. And then this doesn't guarantee any job. And I don't think that this is kind of the place you want to be as a company or as an employee of the company. And I can simply not stand here and say, hey, this is evil, and close my eyes of what's happening around there. I totally see the point of automation as kind of an interesting topic to discuss as a society, but that's a huge topic, and we just started doing that, and I think it's good to discuss it. But from that individual point of view, I think it's very naive to just say, okay, we automate something and that will put people out of the job.
So let us now deep dive into your book. Let's talk a little bit about what can a reader expect when they take on the book Practical Process Automation. What are some of the sections you covered on the book, and what can we expect from it?
Yeah, so actually I thought about writing another book for quite a while. I was always like, it's too much work, I probably don't do it. And I was always like, okay, but it's really missing. Because I saw that if you look at process automation as a whole topic, you find books around let's say the more organizational aspects of that. But you don't find a lot of things about the technical aspects of it. And this goes hand in hand in a way with the perception I saw in developer communities. So my natural place to be are developer communities, or let's say architect communities, these kind of very technical communities. And very often the picture these people have of process automation and BPM is pretty negative. It's in a way, this is this old idea of generating code from models which doesn't work, or the business doing things themselves which doesn't work. And this is not for me, these unhandy big tool suites and whatever. And this is not true anymore. I mean, we have very good tooling, and we're kind of the proof, but there are others that are doing similar things, not as good as we do, of course, but there are others that do things as well, where it can be very developer friendly. Or if you look at cloud, for example, all the cloud vendors are doing kind of a workflow engine also. So there's definitely the need, and it should be in the developers world. And this was always nagging me, like we need to bring it to the developers. We need to make them understand why this is important. I don't want to sell anything to them which they don't need, but I truly believe you can solve certain problems better if you have these kind of methodology. And that was my motivation then to write this book. And that also means, in a way, I'm trying to cover kind of, let's say, the life cycle. Like I'm starting to understand what is process automation from a developer's perspective, which also means I'm describing what it is not. So a lot of the BPMS promises from the past is normally not totally what developers love. So I also describe what it's probably not, but what's process automation? What's a workflow engine? How can I automate a process with a workflow engine? The challenge I have in the book is that I'm writing product neutral as much as possible. I mean, I'm of course always having Camunda in my head. I can't stop that, but I'm trying to write in a way that is also useful if you're using different products. But I want to show very concrete hands-on code, because I think that's the only way of making people really understand what I mean. I mean, I can write 20 pages of text, but a bit of source code normally shows it very, very concise. So I always have runnable code on GitHub, like in addition to the book. And that means I hope I managed that well, that he can read through the first chapters, understand what a workflow engine is, what a BPMN model, an executable BPMN model is, and how this is really executed, and what questions you need to answer in order to make use of it, how it influences your architecture, and these kind of questions. So that's kind of the first part of the book. And then I put that into perspective of, let's say, the bigger enterprise architecture questions, like, okay, now I understood how I can automate that one process, but how does that fit into the picture of the whole? I mean, I have probably microservices nowadays, or some kind of service-oriented architecture. So I have processes implemented at different places. I have one process touching different services. How can I organize that? How does that work? How does that play together with all these modern architecture trends, in a way, like event-driven architectures, reactive, or cloud native, or you name it. There are a couple of these which are framing at least modern architectures today, and that's very interesting to put that in perspective. Like, how does that work? Or domain-driven design, or this kind of stuff. So that's kind of the second part of the book where I do this, and I have a whole chapter where I discuss choreography versus orchestration. So event-driven ping pong, how I call it, or orchestration with a workflow engine. And also, like, for example, discussing, is the workflow engine something centralized? Is it a separate thing like we did 10 years back? You always had a BPM layer and SOA layer. Is it like this, or is it part of the microservices? Is much more decentralized? So a lot of these questions. And then I have a third part. It's the thinnest part, to be honest, but I was over the agreed size amount of pages already, so I had to stop writing. But the third part is about putting it into practice, like looking at the journey, how to apply it in your company. What are like typical ways? What should you look at? What should you probably ignore in the beginning to be successful with the first project? These kind of questions. So that's kind of the very short, quick overview of what I captured in that lovely book.
And we can get it on Amazon, I'm sure, or on Kindle and all the different platforms out there. Is it available everywhere?
I guess so. I mean, Oreilly is managing that. I just think it should be available everywhere. I can confirm on Amazon. That's how I got my copy. It's on the Oreilly platform. So if you have a subscription to Oreilly, you can read it there. At the moment, you can also get a free PDF, which is sponsored by Camunda on the homepage. So if you go to the book's homepage, which is processautomationbook.com, okay. But that should be easy to find. If not, send me an email or tweet me. I'm happy to share the link. But there, I linked the page on the Camunda side where you can get a free PDF if you enter some data. So it should be easy to get. That's the whole message. Yeah,
great.
I'm also giving courses at Oreilly, doing a bit of Oreilly advertising here. Training courses, so that would be kind of if you really follow along, that's probably also interesting to look at.
Awesome, great. So we'll be sure to add some of those links with the video so people can also check them out and see if they're interested in learning more about this. Now, you mentioned architecture part of it. You mentioned IT and code. If I'm not an IT audience, if I'm not a software engineer, or if I'm not, an actual developer, can I still read it and benefit from it, or am I going to be completely lost as I go through it? What would be your input on non-IT audiences taking on this book?
So, I mean, it's not always black and white. It's not IT and non-IT. That's a whole spectrum, and that's the big problem always also when you're discussing roles. So every company I see, roles are very different, especially roles, let's say, in the middle, like a business analyst. Some of them, they could program their own stuff. Some of them, they can't. So it's a big spectrum. And the same, I think, goes for the readers. I mean, if you're a developer or architect, that's kind of the main target group, obviously. If you're, let's say, IT manager, if you're even in the business and want to understand possibilities, if you're a business analyst, which is not too technical, this should also be interesting to read. If you're, let's say, if your mind is open to thinking about technology, and probably you also have some curiosity to understand the IT aspects of it. You might just flip a few of the pages faster, where it's probably about more technical depth. But I think a couple of the chapters are definitely interesting, and some of the chapters, like the journey to introduce the whole process automation approach, is not very technical in any way. So I think a couple of other roles could also benefit from it.
All right. And you mentioned earlier on this conversation that you also collaborated with Jacob on your previous book, which is Real Life BPMN. How does that book connect with this? Should we read them in a specific order, or that doesn't even matter? Can we read them apart and still get, the best from both worlds? So what's kind of the connection between process automation or practical process automation and the real life BPMN?
So what we did in Real Life BPMN was really writing about the standard BPMN. I think the audience might know that here, business process model and notation. It's an ISO standard to model processes graphically, but the killer feature in a way is that it's not only a graphical model, but it also defines the so-called execution semantics. So underneath, it's an XML file, and you can give that to a workflow engine, and this engine knows exactly how to execute that. So that was always the promise of BPMN. This is why it's, from my perspective, so super successful. And I don't know any other workflow language that has kind of the same level of adoption or the same level of maturity. So what I'm trying to say is BPMN is still super important and super useful. The Real Life BPMN book focused on the notation. So basically what we did there is, in one chapter we described the whole notation, what you can do with it and how you can express certain things and what patterns you probably use for certain problems. That's useful for everybody who is kind of exposed to BPMN, especially also people that are in a way only modeling. In the beginning, actually, I think most of our training participants were people that did process documentation, so not execution at all. And then what we also did in the book, what I find interesting, and it's still pretty relevant, is we defined a certain framework to use this to describe like strategic models, what I want to do, and operational models, how work's really done in reality. And probably that takes too long to explain why this is a really cool idea. But in a way, that's kind of very often the foundation to go into execution projects. And that's kind of the connection. So Real Life BPM doesn't go into this technical depth of how do I really execute a BPMN model and how does a workflow engine really works. It kind of gives you that perspective. Hey, there are workflow engines, you can do that. But it's very thin on that. And Real Life or practical process automation goes into the whole execution aspect. Hey, how can I use a workflow engine to automate processes? And by the way, BPMN might be a good choice. And it gives you just enough BPMN to understand it. Sure. And then it might make sense to jump to Real Life BPMN. And that means you can have them both. That makes sense as an addition. And depending on your role, you might start with the one or the other earlier on. Or just read one. I mean, it's also a question of learning types. I learned by doing. So I'm not so good at reading books cover to cover. I think I would read this, see a bit of BPMN, and then try it out. And then learn the BPM elements I need when doing it. But I know other people that really learn much better if they do it like cover to cover or like participate in a training course. So every human is a bit different on how they learn. So.
All right, well, great. And like you mentioned, there is a Spanish version of this book as well. So definitely be checking that out if you guys are interested in learning more about Real Life BPMN. And we're in the talks of eventually perhaps having a conversation like this on that other book with the professor you mentioned. So that'll be also cool. Interesting to check and eventually get on here.
That was actually in the early days of Camunda. I was in Chile there at the university also giving a talk. I remember that very well. And that gave me a good connection also to that professor which translated the book. And that was interesting to sneak into the BPM community in Chile, but it's I think more than 10 years back. No way.
Wow.
Quite too long.
Wow. All right. So before we close, are there any last words of wisdom, any final message you would like to leave the audience with before we close this interview? I know you shared a lot of nuggets from knowledge, but are there any specific words you would like to close before we wrap up?
That's always hard to condense, but in a way, I think, for me, the important thing is that people understand that process automation is not only very important in these days of digitalization and so on and so forth, but also quite an enjoyable thing. I do that since years and I love it. And it can be very technical. Get started with it, look at it. If you have any use case, just do something with it. I can just recommend it and hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
Great. All right, Bernd. Well, thank you very much once again for joining us. Thank you for making some space in your agenda. Like you mentioned, you were just a guest speaker a few weeks back, and I know you're very active on giving talks and presentations all over the world. So thank you for making some time to join us as well.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy these conversations. So thanks.
All right, great. Bueno, pues gracias a todos los que vieron el video. Espero que les haya gustado y que hayan capturado algunas de las ideas principales de por qué este tema de automatización de procesos es tan relevante hoy en día y puedan haber aclarado también algunos conceptos que por aquí cubrimos en la conversación. Así que les invito a que se suscriban, a que le den like al video, que lo compartan y que dejen sus comentarios. Y muchas gracias por conectarse una vez más. Hasta luego.